Today I have as my guests two people who were introduced to me by a woman called Emily Zinos from an organization called Hands Across the Aisle Coalition. She saw what I've been doing with regard to trans issues, and she wanted me to speak with some people who have worked with her, trying to bring some clarity, truth, and well-being to society. So I'm going to introduce each of my guests and ask them to tell me about themselves. So I have Ms. Antonia Bookbinder and Ms. Kaylee Triller. So Antonia, if you'd like to start, please. Who are you and how did you find yourself on this podcast?
I'm Antonia Bookbinder. I'm a mother of two 22-year-old, my kids are twins, 22-year-olds at this point. And I came to this from watching various of my feminist friends being told that they couldn't speak on women's issues because of attacks from the trans community. And somehow at some point found myself in the Hands Across the Aisle coalition with a variety of women from across the political spectrum who are very concerned about the impact of trans issues on the lives of women and girls, but also just the lives of our children generally.
Okay, thank you. And Kaylee?
Yeah, so I'm Kaylee, and I fell down the rabbit hole about 3 years ago now. I got fired from my job of 17 years over the trans issue. I had never experienced anything revolving around it before. I'm a conservative Christian, so I approached this from a very different perspective. But I was communications director, and they wanted me to sell a new policy opening our organization's locker rooms on the basis of gender identity as opposed to biological sex. And so as that was going on, I wrote a blog from my perspective as a rape survivor, and it went viral, and I started to hear from women across the country and found out that this was a lot bigger an issue than I had any idea, and found myself with some unlikely bedfellows, if you will, kind of allies in the fight that I would not have expected other than that. So
this is my first time speaking with either of you, and so I have no skin in the game at all. Just as a psychologist, when I see something going wrong, and basically I just realized that what my colleagues and I were being told to do and to say just didn't seem to jibe with the realities of what I knew about trans issues. I don't have much experience. I have a few trans patients, but I teach about it. And I was speaking with some big names in the field, and it just seemed that people were being, I'm going to say, forced, essentially, to use a language, to take an approach that is not necessarily grounded in science and is not necessarily helping people. And I guess my tumble down the rabbit hole was when Dr. Jordan Peterson from Toronto, he was talking about the forced language issue. So it's not that we're being asked to be compassionate and to use certain pronouns. We're being told that if we don't, it can be considered a hate crime. And legislation was enacted earlier this year, I think it was April or May, and the language seems okay. It's basically saying we want to make sure that trans people are not discriminated against and that they have their dignity, safety, well-being, and respect accorded to them that they should. But it takes it further. And we've had a number of issues, only a few so far, where people say or do the wrong thing and they're being accused of potentially hate crimes and are at risk of losing their jobs, being suspended, or having some other terrible outcome. So that's kind of how I came into this in a grander sense. It had nothing to do with trans issues. It had to do with free speech and governments enacting certain things over their populace. So that's it for me. And I just want what's best for people. And since I started doing it, I've spoken to more people who have told me about this nightmare behind the curtains that most people don't know about. So I'm going to start with Kaylee, because when you say bathroom issues or change room issues, you are going to get a very strong response in different quarters. So can you tell us, please, what your experience has been, including how you got fired and why you're so concerned about this?
So initially when I encountered this, it was all about locker rooms for me. So first of all, I live in Washington State. So we're about kind of probably where you are in terms of politics and general ideology. But nobody that I knew of, because I don't come from radical feminist circles where they have these discussions, this was not a national conversation when it hit me. We didn't have anybody talking about gender identity. I mean, of course, we all, I think, probably encountered transgender people on occasion. Nothing was a big deal. We let them live their lives. There was no huge issue. But for me, when my boss came to me and told me that I was going to craft this new policy, it was just so absurd. I mean, it really was just like the height of absurdity to me to be told that there would be grown males with fully intact who could, because they said so, use locker rooms where my little girl gets ready for swimming class. And so, people want to talk about this as a bathroom bill or a bathroom issue. It's not really even for me, it's always been locker rooms. Not that it actually makes a huge difference. There's egregious harm that happens, especially to females, in those spaces that are intimate already. So to me, to open up that door and let any man who says he wants to come in and shower next to me can because he says so, that's not this new conversation for females. And so I pushed back and I just said no, and I got myself fired, and I wrote the blog, like I said. And what I was so startled to discover was just this number and this volume and the diversity of the women responding to this blog that I wrote from my perspective of somebody who's worked very, very hard, mind you, at reclaiming her own boundaries and her own voice, because I was assaulted in a bathroom setting. So that's intimate space for me. And that's kind of where I encountered the feminists who've been fighting this, for the radical feminists, I should say, who've been fighting this for quite some time. But yeah, you're right. There is this huge backlash, and violent, I may say, an actual violent backlash. I mean, we tried to have a press conference here in Tacoma, and there's some YouTube video of it. The police told us it was unsafe to come outside because I want to use accurate pronouns. I mean, it was just so startling to me. And there's so much more behind the curtain, like you said, than I had any idea, with the sterilization of children and things of that nature. So I'm fighting for about 3 years now.
3 years, you said?
Yeah.
And there are slogans. It was in the UK that it started, I believe. It may have been in the States as well, where they started this, I guess, riffing off of punch a Nazi. It became punch a TERF. I've been asking people, no one knows what that means. If you're not involved in the movement in any way, these are new words. And even cisgender. I teach human sexuality at one of the most progressive schools in Canada. And I asked my students, and maybe 5 to 10% of the students, even in the year 2017, know what the word cisgender means. And this is a very progressive school in a big metropolitan city. So it's sad that people who are fighting for their own rights, respect, dignity, and so on, go so over the top in expecting everybody to be on the same page as they are. And if you're not, you get called. And I'll ask you, Kaylee, to start. What do you get called?
Things I probably shouldn't say out loud. I mean, I've just never seen such vitriol. I mean, they send me Jesus porn, and they send me death threats. They post my address on the internet.
Oh, they doxed you, jeez.
It's just nasty. It's just really, really unacceptable behavior. It's violent, and it's, we're going to come kill you in your sleep and choke your children. It's because I don't agree that you're a woman, and you won't be. That's not your fault. That's not mine. But I'm not going to play make-believe along with you so that you'll like me. I mean, I don't like to live that way. I'm very much like you in that sense, that freedom-minded individual. And I don't like to be controlled. So Let me make decisions and say what I want.
So in this whole fight, if you weren't as religious as you are, do you think it would look any different?
No, it's a truth thing for me. And granted, I find my truth in my faith. But, I mean, I can work alongside Antonia. I co-founded this coalition with a lesbian radical feminist activist because we have shared experience of living a human female. That's in common. That's not rooted in my religion. That's rooted in this material reality.
And again, and your concerns about the locker room bill or bathroom bill, whatever, is rooted then in your own experience as a survivor of sexual assault, you said?
Yes. People don't necessarily understand unless you've lived it, but too many females in particular, I mean, both male and female have way too many sexual traumas. But I worked really hard. Even as a college basketball player, I would still shower in my underwear. That's just true for me. And I know that's true for so many women. So to be told that men were going to once again take what they wanted by force without my consent, and then to call me a bigot when I protested, was just a bridge too far for me. Because I've been raising my little girl to say, no means no, and you get to define what your boundaries are. A man doesn't get to define them for you.
Right. And again, we're trying to be compassionate, understanding, and so on. But if you think statistically speaking, the number of women, sadly, or men as well, who have been sexually assaulted far outnumber people who identify as trans. So even if it's a numbers game, the numbers are not on their side. Okay, so Antonia, in your experience in working with Hands Across the Aisle, what have you brought basically, and what have you experienced as far as the different people that you've been working with?
I actually adore the women in Hands Across the Aisle. We disagree about many, many things, but we have some fundamental shared values about the role of civility in political discourse, about working with people who do not necessarily agree with us on every single issue, about prioritizing the rights of women and girls in this struggle. I would say I came to this largely from a perspective of, being concerned about people's welfare. And the trans movement has done a very, very good job of portraying trans women as the most vulnerable, the most oppressed group of women out there. Some of that is because the high death statistics are mostly trans women of color who are working in the sex industry. And we all know that there are really good statistics that women of color are disproportionately vulnerable to domestic violence and to sexual violence, and that people in prostitution are also disproportionately subject to violence. And those two things really contribute to the rates of violence experienced by trans women of color. If you look at sort of the typical activist in this field, it's mostly white genetic males who are not working in the sex industry. Their rates of experiencing violence are actually significantly lower overall than women or men. So I'm really not persuaded by we are so terribly, terribly subject to violence. And I want to be on the side of people who are actually vulnerable to violence, but that's not generally the people who are most vocal on this issue. And the other thing that really brought me to this is concern about gender nonconforming children. I am, and have always been, a fairly masculine of center woman. I've been married with my husband for 28, 29 years now, but I am a very masculine woman. I have a crew cut. I look pretty masculine, and my daughter looks pretty masculine. And I saw what was starting to happen to my child as a result of this trans ideology. And I was particularly concerned when Dr. Zucker in Toronto was fired and forced to close his practice because he advocated a policy of watchful waiting with gender nonconforming children. And I've become very worried over the last several years that the girl that I was as a child and young teenager or young woman, today the social pressure to trans myself would be astronomical. And the idea that we are doing this to our children is really very, very disturbing to me.
And if I saw you in your childhood, at what age was it always, or was there a certain age where I'd say, she does look more like a tomboy or a boy than your stereotypical girl? When would that have been?
I was always a tomboy. I was always, okay. And this, again, like Kaylee, I have a history of abuse. My abuse also happened in a bathroom being observed by a male family member. I was always uncomfortable with my body as a woman or as a girl. It was always a source of vulnerability to me. And I just was always more of an outside, wearing boy clothes, doing boy activities kind of person. I remember when I was 4 years old, my parents took me to Santa Claus. And Santa Claus was all like, "Oh, little girl, what do you want?" And I remember being really ticked off at this dude being Santa Claus. I mean, I believed in Santa Claus, but I was still annoyed at how he was treating me like a girl. So I asked for a truck. And I remember I didn't really want a truck at all. I didn't care about a truck, but I wanted to yank this man's chain. So I asked for a truck for Christmas because I didn't want to be the girl in the equation.
You must have seen the article. It came out earlier this year. A woman wrote, I think it was the New York Times, "My daughter's not trans, she's a tomboy," or something along those lines. And the vitriol directed at her. And I came to her defense. I've never met her. I just started tweeting to people like, "What's wrong with you? You don't know this mother." And I've talked about it so many times where it was such a daughter positive, female positive, and even, yes, a trans positive article. And it got so distorted. And then when you talk about Dr. Ken Zucker and his firing from CAMH, people don't look at the facts. they will Google a blog and see that, oh, yes, he did all these horrible things. He was doing reparative or conversion therapy. He was harming all these children and so on. And people don't want to step back, take an objective look at the information instead of just confirming their biases. And I see that's been a huge problem in the narrative, in this whole debate or discussion or issue, which is very concerning. It sounds like you mentioned ideological. I mean, that's really what it is. And I've taken to saying that some people sound like they're literally in a cult. And once they are confronted with information that doesn't jibe with their worldview or the narrative or agenda, their reasoning shuts down and they go on the attack.
Like a true cult, there's a shunning period and a punishment and a alienation. And yeah, I think you're right. That's appropriate.
It's absolutely a cult. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
Right. And as soon as you say that, then of course, you're transphobic, et cetera, et cetera. So, Antonia, you mentioned with your daughter, who you say, has some of the similar traits. Please tell me, if you can, A, when did this start happening? Because this hasn't always been the case, of course. It's only been the last few years. When did you start noticing what was going on? And B, what has been the impact on her?
Okay, first I would like to say that my daughter, I've actually talked with her. I have her permission and support, enthusiastic support, to discuss this, her experiences. So my daughter, I have, number one, I am a fairly masculine of center woman, so she grew up with me as a role model. She also has a male twin, and there's considerable medical research that young women who have male twins have been exposed to significantly elevated levels of testosterone and do tend to be masculine of center. So number one, she had me as a role model, and she had whatever genetics came from me,
right.
But also prenatal exposure to testosterone would have masculinized her anyway. So she was never much of a girly girl kind of person. She went through a princess phase that lasted, as far as I can recall, maybe 6 months. It did involve me sewing her an elaborate princess dress, which I think she wore twice. And then it was the end of the princess phase. And that was always completely okay with her. And with us, we are fairly progressive parents. I actually always, from a very early age, explained to my children that segregating, boys versus girls kinds of games were exactly as ethical as black kids versus white kids, and that we were not going to do any team playing that was boys versus girls, which made me somewhat unpopular with other homeschooling families in my community. But my kids got very good at saying, oh, no, we're not allowed to play boys versus girls games. And then puberty is always a very hard time for any person because your body changes. All these weird things start happening to your body. And then people start treating you differently. And fortunately, at that point, my daughter had, for some reason, picked up a book by a philosopher named Alain de Botton named The Consolations of Philosophy. And she read that book, and it was sort of an introduction to Socrates and Seneca, and one of the chapters was on Montaigne, who was a early 16th century French philosopher. And one of his essays is about the humiliations of having a body. He was really one of the first philosophers to really talk about the humiliations of having a body, and he talked about erectile dysfunction and excretion. I mean, he was really very, for his age, very frank about the gross aspects of having a human body. And so she read this, and she, it was sort of a popularizer kind of presentation. But I remember at one point, like her first or second time she'd had her period, I have her permission to tell this story. She came stomping up into the kitchen, and she's like, this is awful. This period stuff is exactly what Montaigne was talking about, and I hate it. I was like, yeah, yes, this was... Montaigne, frankly, did not talk at all about menstruation, but yes, this is part of the gross aspect of having a body, inhabiting a body. And yeah, it's really hard. And then a couple of years after that was when she was maybe 14 or 15, was when a lot of the trans stuff started happening. And I mean, I've got to say, I'm a fairly left-wing parent. I homeschooled my children. I raised my children with radical feminist ideas, the ideas about consent and about, in our materialistic sort of view, yourself is an emergent property of having a body. And so your brain is not separate from your body. Yourself is not separate from your body. My children were raised with this philosophy, but they were also They had access to Tumblr, they had access to blogs, they had access to Facebook. I discovered a couple of years ago, my daughter went through probably 2 years from the time she was 14 to maybe 16 or 17, thinking that because she was a masculine of centered girl and because she liked boys, she must really be a gay man, a gay trans man. And so she would spend time online researching whether she could get a binder. It's appalling to me that, frankly, my daughter could have gotten someone to take her to a physician and gotten, cross-sex hormones without my consent. She could have bought binders without my consent. I would never have known this. And the idea that my daughter went through this experience online without my knowing what kind of ideology she was encountering and sort of thinking about, that's really horrifying to me. And my daughter was as protected from this ideology as I think it is really possible to be in contemporary North American culture. And it affected her anyway.
And that's so important because I don't think people fully appreciate the impact of the internet on the psychosocial and psychosexual development of children. In the history of humanity, we've never had such vast exposure to so much information before the child is able to process it. And as you're saying, Antonia, I mean, you are like the prototypical parent whose child should be immune, if any child should be immune to the influences of this, and yet she still did this. And I'm going to ask you, you weren't even aware of it for a couple of years.
I was not, no. This was a very secret, sort of depressive, she was experiencing a lot of stuff in her life. And thankfully for Alain de Botton and her exposure to feminists and her exposure to philosophers and her exposure to science, this never sort of really got a toehold with her, but it got enough of a toehold to cause her significant suffering.
And the fact that she didn't continue in that pathway, they're going to say that's because somehow you influenced her or you prevented her from her natural progression to be this gay trans male that she's meant to be. You've forced her to be a de-sister, is I'm sure what you've been accused of.
Well, I haven't been accused of it because I'm no longer in contact with any of the people who would have accused me of it, but I have been accused of being a bad parent and foisting my ideology on my children quite a bit by various people in the former circles that I inhabited online.